recall that the One Bermuda Alliance, during their tenure in government, doubled Bermuda's debt from $1.2 billion to $2.4 billion. This significant debt increase left the Bermuda Progressive Labor Party, upon returning to government in 2017, with virtually no room for further borrowing. Thus, it was anticipated by many that our new government would be required to increase the country's debt ceiling, which was, at that time, $2.5 billion. However, Mr. Speaker, much to the surprise of those that think the worst of the Progressive Labor Party's fiscal capabilities, we held true to our 2017 election commitments, reprioritized our spending, and not only avoided increasing the debt ceiling in 2018, but also reduced our deficit from $182 million under the former government to just under $17 million in the first year. Mr. Speaker, shortly thereafter, in April 2018, the ratings agency Standard & Poor's published its review of Bermuda and its improved outlook rating from stable to positive, stating that it viewed the prudent fiscal policy of the new Progressive Labor Party government as positive. Those are not my words, Mr. Speaker. They are the words of a respected, sound, and unbiased credit rating agency on the performance of the Progressive Labor Party upon returning to government. Mr. Speaker, in February 2019, this government delivered the 2019-20 budget statement where we projected a budgeted surplus for the first time in over 20 years. It is worth noting that after the first 6 months of that fiscal year, it was reported in this House, based on our projections, that we were confident we would meet our targets and achieve a modest surplus by the end of the fiscal year. So, Mr. Speaker, this government immediately reduced our deficits, was given a positive outlook from Standard & Poor's, had us on a path to a surplus, and did not raise our debt ceiling. However, Mr. Speaker, much of the hard work and efforts of this government were quickly undone, as later that year we received notice of a default relating to the Caroline Bay project at Morgan's Point. As a result of the default notice, the government was required to raise the debt ceiling by borrowing $200 million to honor an obligation that the former government had committed us to, with a guarantee that the Bermuda Progressive Labor Party had vehemently opposed. Mr. Speaker, we have spoken about the Morgan's Point guarantee on numerous occasions. However, it must be clear Okay. If that's what the speaker wants, that's what I can do. I've been advised that the House Assembly was unable to hear the beginning of the speech, so we're going to start again. Can they hear now? Can you hear me, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the Bermuda of 2022 has known 2 years of pandemic trials. Public finances have been strained to meet the community's need for public health and economic support. Families have experienced unprecedented pressures to meet their commitments, educate their children, and combat the isolation brought about by the times in which we live. Mr. Speaker, extraordinary measures have had to be adopted to meet the most unique challenges in a generation. In the bleakest hours when hope has seemed in short supply, we have drawn strength from a community that has rallied to the aid of those in need, providing food, mental health support, and spiritual enrichment. It has not been easy, but through our community spirit and resilience, we have overcome obstacles and disappointments in our path from the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Speaker, it is important to recognize that the obstacles and disappointments we have faced and continue to face are finite. And I remind us all of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. We must never lose infinite hope. That statement eloquently reiterates that our hope must outlast our challenges. Thus, in presenting this statement in support of the estimates of revenue and expenditure for the fiscal year 2022-23, the government is determined to restore some measure of hope to the people of Bermuda. Okay. I've been asked to stop by the speaker as they are unable to hear me, so stand by.
I'll turn it down just a little bit. Speaker, could you say something to me? Just turn it down.
Mr. Speaker, we can hear you. President, they're in the other room. We're trying to figure out what the topic is, but we still have not received anything from your ministry for this year point. So they're in that room trying to resolve all of that now, but it needs to come from your end.
Someone needs to sign in. I wonder if you should get your headphones, sign in. Someone just needs to sign in so if he says anything, see you that.
Remember, your mic is live, see?
Yeah, I'm definitely good. I didn't be able to turn it up. Turn it up a little.
No, this isn't on the billboard. It's not on the Robert.
Mr. Speaker, I've received the documents. We're standing by whenever you're ready.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition has received the statements. Sorry, I think you're muted, sir. Let me just get that confirmed that they've been circulated. Yep. Thank you. We have confirmation that they have been circulated on SharePoint, so all members can now follow the Premier as he reads this year's budget statement. Members of the public and the listening audience, we apologize for that technical difficulty, but we had to get it correct in order that the proper record and proceeding is done for the House. Yes, we like to have the public listening in, but the House is what's paramount here, and we have to have the proper record so that the history and proceedings of what was done and how it was presented is correctly recorded. So I ask for the listening audience to accept our apologies on the hiccup that we had to resolve. It all seems to be resolved now, and we will have this year's budget statement read by the Premier, Minister of Finance. Premier, you have the floor.
Resolved now. I'm ready to copy the statement.
I sent it over to the consent.
The members of the House. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Speaker.
Good. Yeah, I'm ready. You're good. You're good to go.
Mr. Speaker, the Bermuda of 2022 has known 2 years of pandemic trials. Public finances have been strained to meet the community's need for public health and economic support. Families have experienced unprecedented pressures to meet their commitments, educate their children, and combat the isolation brought about by the times in which we live. Mr. Speaker, extraordinary measures have had to be adopted to meet the most unique challenges in a generation. In the bleakest hours, when hope has seemed in short supply, we have drawn strength from a community that has rallied to the aid of those in need, providing food, mental health support, and spiritual enrichment. It has not been easy, but through our community spirit and resilience, we have overcome obstacles and disappointments in our path from the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Speaker, it is important to recognize that the obstacles and disappointments we have faced and continue to face are finite. And I remind us all of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King: we must never lose infinite hope. That statement eloquently reiterates that our hope must outlast our challenges. Thus, in presenting this statement in support of the estimates of revenue and expenditure for the fiscal year 2022-2023, the government is determined to restore some measure of hope to the people of Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, moving beyond the pandemic means more than ending the use of safety or eliminating the need for large group exemptions. For the government, moving beyond the pandemic means renewing its focus on delivering this country's most progressive platform ever. And the budget table today will support that delivery. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member for Pembroke Southeast, the former Minister of Finance, brought to this role a unique acumen that served this country well. It is through his considerable effort and the diligent work of Bermuda's cabinet and public service executive that I am pleased to advise this honorable House that this budget is delivered having received an unqualified audit of the Consolidated Fund for fiscal year 2020-2021. Additionally, our budget performance has Bermuda's net debt $68 million lower than was forecast just last year, giving this government the ability to provide relief to hardworking families and support struggling businesses while making investments in Bermuda's economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, due to political rhetoric, issues can often be distorted. Given that our Westminster system has a government and an opposition whose job it is to criticize the current government, sometimes the facts can get lost, or at the very least overshadowed. It is therefore more useful to rely on independent assessments from persons who have no political agenda.
Will be referred to in this statement, as it is important for our country to understand what independent observers are saying about Bermuda's economy. Mr. Speaker, in the statement that I deliver today on behalf of this Bermuda Progressive Labor Party government, I will be frank and honest with the people of this country regarding the challenges that we face. However, my statement today will highlight the government's commitment to support Bermuda's families by providing additional relief and continuing to fund core social programs. The statement will highlight the economic progress achieved, a path for sustainable growth, and the need for this government to push the envelope to ensure economic success for future generations of Bermudians. Mr. Speaker, the hopes of 2017 have been set back by the coronavirus pandemic, and the issues that we wish to address then are no less real and no less urgent now. However, it would be disingenuous to say that there has been no progress made on critical issues under this Progressive Labor Party government. Mr. Speaker, history will recall that the One Bermuda Alliance, during their tenure in government, doubled Bermuda's debt from $1.2 billion to $2.4 billion. This significant debt increase left the Progressive Labor Party upon returning to government in 2017 with virtually no room for further borrowing. Thus, it was anticipated by many that our new government would be required to increase the country's debt ceiling, which was, at that time, $2.5 billion. However, Mr. Speaker, much to the surprise of those that think the worst of the Progressive Labor Party's fiscal capabilities, we held true to our 2017 election commitments, reprioritized our spending, and not only avoided increase the debt ceiling in 2018, but also reduced our deficit from $182 million under the former government to $70 million in just the first year. Mr. Speaker, shortly thereafter, in April 2018, the rating agency Standard & Poor's published its review of Bermuda and improved its outlook rating from stable to positive, stating that it viewed the prudent fiscal policy of the new Progressive Labor Party government as positive. Those are not my words, Mr. Speaker. They are the words of a respected, sound, and unbiased credit rating agency on the performance of the Progressive Labor Party upon returning to government. Mr. Speaker, in February 2019, this government delivered the 2019-20 budget statement, where we projected a budgeted surplus for the first time in over 20 years. It is worth noting that after the first 6 months of that fiscal year, it was reported in this House, based on our projections, that we were confident we would meet our targets and achieve a modest surplus by the end of the fiscal year. So, Mr. Speaker, this government immediately reduced our deficits and was given a positive outlook from Standard & Poor's, had us on a path to a surplus, and did not raise the country's debt ceiling. However, Mr. Speaker, much of the hard work and efforts of this government were quickly undone, as later that year we received a notice of default relating to the Caroline Bay project at Morgan's Point. As a result of the default notice, the government was required to raise the debt ceiling by borrowing $200 million to honor an obligation that the former government had committed us to, with a guarantee that the Progressive Labor Party, while in opposition, had vehemently opposed. Mr. Speaker, we have spoken about the Morgan's Point guarantee on numerous occasions. However, it must be clear that the debt ceiling was not raised until we were required to honor the guarantee issued by the One Bermuda Alliance government. Further, Mr. Speaker, shortly thereafter, Bermuda and the world was faced with a once-in-a-century pandemic. Given the uncertainty surrounding the pandemic and the profoundly negative impact that it had on our healthcare system, our economy, especially tourism, and overall way of life, the government raised the debt ceiling to borrow additional funds to cover COVID-related expenses and to provide support to residents who were suddenly without work. Mr. Speaker, there is no disputing the facts that I have laid out. Upon returning to government in 2017, the Progressive Labor Party was executing its agenda and laying the foundation for long-term economic growth before having to address two major events beyond our control, namely the Morgan's Point guarantee and the COVID-19 pandemic. In light of those challenges and the other potential risks looming, such as the new OECD Global Tax Agreement, challenging tourism market, inflation in the United States, and continued drainage of public funds to cover the Skyport minimum revenue guarantee, this government is committed to making the difficult and sometimes unpopular decisions required to steer us back to a path of economic recovery. Mr. Speaker and honorable members, we did it before and we will do it again. Mr. Speaker, no review of what this government has done since it was elected to office is complete without recognizing the unprecedented support it has made available to residents and businesses in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Over the last 2 years, this government has spent in excess of $100 million in direct assistance to citizens and businesses, including over $80 million of direct assistance to individuals. This started immediately after declaration of a pandemic and continued into this fiscal year due to the outbreaks that the island has experienced. Additionally, support has been given to small, medium, and large businesses through the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, and there have been a number of tax concessions and rebates that have been made to support various industries in Bermuda. The narrative that this government has not helped the people is simply not true. Mr. Speaker, as part of emergency measures related to the pandemic, the government provided $6.7 million in payroll and land tax relief to our local hotels, bars, and restaurants as an additional measure of support for an industry that has suffered the most during this pandemic. Mr. Speaker, one common refrain that is hurled towards this government from many quarters is that the Progressive Labor Party government keeps expanding the size of the public service. It is something that is often said, but it has no basis in fact. The most accurate measure of the persons employed in the public service comes from the government's payroll records. These reports are compiled quarterly and show a vastly different picture than the common refrain from the opposition. At the end of June 2017, 3 weeks before the Progressive Labor Party was elected, the number of persons paid by the government was 4,625. 4 years later, at the end of June 2021, that figure stood at 4,642, which, Mr. Speaker, is inclusive of the staff that were part of the coronavirus response, an increase of just 17 staff over that 4-year period. We can also look at the December numbers, as that is the most recent quarter. At the end of December 2017, the number of persons paid by the government was 4,438. 4 years later, at the end of December 2021, that figure stood at 4,362, which again is inclusive of staff which were part of the coronavirus response, a decrease of 76 staff over that 4-year period. Mr. Speaker, the numbers fluctuate throughout the year, as during the summer you have seasonal employees like lifeguards. However, the figures speak for themselves. Since 2017, the Progressive Labor Party has been prudent in hiring and has made investments in technology to make government more efficient. We have not expanded the size of the public service, and we continue, as always, to manage the island's affairs with our extremely delicate financial situation in mind. Mr. Speaker, since our election, this government has been laser focused on executing the pledges made in our election platform, which were endorsed overwhelmingly by Bermuda's electorate. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, we pledged that every Bermudian would be provided access to Bermuda College regardless of their financial status. Since 2017, a total of 174 students have graduated or earned a certificate as a result of us keeping that election promise. Students that benefit from new programs often contribute to our economy by joining the local workforce, putting their skills to work. In 2019, the College Promise Merit Award Program was introduced, allowing school students to attend Bermuda College tuition-free, provided they graduated with a GPA of at least 3.0. Since its introduction, 69 students have taken advantage of this reward, and 4 have already graduated from the Bermuda College. Mr. Speaker, our success in providing increased access to Bermuda College can be seen in the enrollment figures. In 2016, enrollment at Bermuda College stood at 926 students. I am pleased to report that it now stands at 1,305, an increase of some 379 students. 379 Bermudians who may not otherwise have had the opportunity to further their education without the support that this government promised it would provide. And this government delivered on that promise. Mr. Speaker, the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, or BDC, is responsible for providing financial support and technical advice to local, small, and medium-sized businesses, overseeing the economic empowerment zones, growing outside vendor markets, and issuing vending licenses. Mr. Speaker, with increased funding and support from the government, the BDC continues to deliver on initiatives such as direct lending microloans, financial grants, and loan guarantees that provide greater access to capital for our local entrepreneurs. The BDC also recently increased its maximum guarantee capacity from 50% to 75% to enhance financing opportunities, and through its new startup payroll tax relief program introduced in 2018-19, the BDC has facilitated 73 businesses starting up, resulting in 110 new jobs. Mr. Speaker, the BDC also develops new financial partnerships, such as with Bermuda Credit Co-op Society, to develop additional financial products to support our local businesses and amplify what the BDC and local banks have provided. Mr. Speaker, the government appreciates the importance of local small and medium-sized businesses and will continue to facilitate and support BDC in their efforts to grow Bermuda's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Mr. Speaker, the Fiscal Responsibility Panel report for 2021 acknowledged the positive momentum around Bermuda's economic recovery efforts. On the subject of Bermuda's economic recovery plan, that report stated, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "We welcome the government's commitment to the ERP. We are encouraged to note that significant progress has already been made with projects in several areas, particularly economic diversification, immigration, renewable energy, and reducing medicine costs," end quote. The Economic Recovery Plan is focused on a strategy of economic diversification, reducing socioeconomic disparities, and leveraging Bermuda's natural resources and geographic advantages. This approach will gradually help solidify the country's economic structure. The goal of each initiative is to generate stimulus by increasing GDP, job creation, and investments, improving investment income. The goal of these initiatives is to generate stimulus by increasing GDP, job creation and investment, improving income, quality of life, and the business environment, reducing economic disparity, and of course, improving public finances. While the expected economic impacts will vary by initiative, work has commenced on virtually all of the 31 initiatives included in the plan. Some initiatives have progressed to an advanced stage, and all others, such as the Economic Investment Certificate, have been fully implemented. To date, the Economic Investment Certificate has generated over $45 million of new investment into the Bermuda economy. Further, Mr. Speaker, the Project Management Office has determined the means to align action plans to accelerate the improvement of economic outcomes. While all initiatives are deemed to be key contributors, 4 initiatives have been identified as those likely to generate a significant social, economic, and employment impact in the short term. The PMO will give additional focus to those 4 initiatives, which will be referred to as lead initiatives, to accelerate these projects and realize significant economic benefits during this fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, thanks to this government's vision, Bermuda is now a recognized global leader in the fintech industry. In 2018, we passed the Digital Assets Business Act in this honorable house and leverage Bermuda's history as an innovative business jurisdiction and the stellar reputation of the Bermuda Monetary Authority to create a new industry in our country. Mr. Speaker, of the 13 digital asset businesses currently licensed by the BMA, 6 of them were licensed in 2021, and 3 licenses have already been issued in 2022. Momentum in this industry is growing, and the number of licensed fintech companies is expected to double this year, while existing entities continue to expand their operations. Fintech companies are investing in Bermuda, creating jobs for Bermudians and contributing to the local economy and to our local charities. This industry will only stand to benefit Bermuda, and it demonstrates why the government must keep the end in sight as it aggressively pursues policies that will make Bermuda an early leader in this field. Despite constant criticism from the opposition, we have persevered, and now Bermuda is reaping the benefits of this government's vision and persistence. Mr. Speaker, I will now focus on the domestic economy. In 2021, Bermuda saw signs of economic growth, supported by a rebound in quarterly gross domestic product data. Positive economic performance was fueled by new international business registrations, visitor spending, greater levels of household consumption, and increased construction activity, indicating a gradual shift towards economic recovery. When compared to 2020, Bermuda's GDP, the primary indicator for economic growth, is estimated to have increased between 3 and 5% in 2021. However, while we are seeing the earlier stages of economic growth, this government recognized that this increase in GDP is not being felt by all segments of society and therefore understands more must be done. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda continues to see growth in international business. 2021 saw a 27.4% increase in new registration, with 934 new companies arriving on our shores, and a 4% increase in jobs of 171 new posts. I'm happy to report that last year, there were more positions added for Bermudians than for guest workers, providing that the balanced policies of the Bermuda Progressive Labor Party can grow international business while Bermudians benefit. It is also important to note, Mr. Speaker, that since 2019, jobs in international businesses have consistently increased, with 391 additional posts added to our economy, representing a growth of 10%. This sector now provides 4,411 jobs within our economy and is the single largest economic activity group. The government will continue to work collaboratively with international business to promote Bermudian employment and advancement. Mr. Speaker, with the rollout of vaccines and the relaxation of border restrictions, the travel industry globally showed signs of a comeback in 2021. And Bermuda's tourism sector reflected that, demonstrated by 77.8% improvement in air visitor spending and a 27.7% improvement in the length of stay of leisure travelers. Despite several COVID-19 related setbacks, Bermuda was also able to host major international sporting events in 2021, such as the Butterfield Bermuda Championship and Sail GP, with the latter alone injecting $5.7 million into the economy. Mr. Speaker, with regards to the construction industry, it is pleasing to report that new planning applications increased from 402 in 2020 to 668 in 2021, amounting to a 66.2% improvement. During the first 3 quarters of 2021, the value of new construction projects grew from $47.1 million in 2020 to $57.5 million in 2021. Mr. Speaker, headline inflation continues to remain low in Bermuda, as reflected in the Consumer Price Index, which indicates an average inflation rate of 1.5% in 2021. Bermuda's balance of payments continues to record relatively large current account surpluses, which are an important strength in the Bermudian economy. Bermuda's total current account surplus over the first 3 quarters of 2021 was recorded at $768 million. This figure is 19.8% more than the $641 million recorded over the first 3 quarters of 2020. Mr. Speaker, sustainable economic growth cannot be achieved without an expansion of jobs within our economy and a reduction in unemployment levels. With a decrease of 3.9% in employment levels in 2021, from 32,427 filled positions to 31,250, this government fully understands that a human-centered recovery is required. Mr. Speaker, this government delivered on increasing the number of jobs in the Bermudian economy in 2018 and 2019. However, the impact of the pandemic on the labor market has been severe, resulting in job losses across most industrial sectors over the past 2 years. The return to pre-pandemic job levels will heavily depend on the success and recovery of Bermuda's tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, the closure of the Fairmont Southampton Hotel and the global decline in the travel and tourism industry are key factors for the accommodation and food service industry, recording the largest job declines of any industrial sector in Bermuda, with a loss of 696 filled positions in 2021. The banking and financials sector also continued to see a steady decline with employment, with 322 fewer jobs, or a 14.1% decline since 2017. Mr. Speaker, I must also note, however, the increase in employment in international business sector from 4,240 filled positions to 2,000 in 2020 to 4,411 in 2021. For the second consecutive year of job decline, Bermudian employment levels declined by 3.4%, non-Bermudian employment declined by 4.1%, and spouse Bermudian employment levels declined by 4.9%. Mr. Speaker, the early indications of recovery are encouraging and signify a return of confidence in the economy. However, with lagging recovery in employment levels, this government recognizes that more must be done. The government remains focused on implementing Bermuda's economic recovery plan and executing initiatives contained in the plan, strategy designed to get Bermudians back to work. Mr. Speaker, while we manage the local economy, Bermuda's status as a top-class international financial center is under constant threat from external forces. These include the OECD Global Minimum Corporate Tax Initiative, a possible resurgence to the coronavirus, the impact of climate change and its correlation with our local insurance and reinsurance industry, geopolitical tensions, rising global interest rates, and increasing global inflation. These risks must be managed and addressed head-on and be mitigated. Mr. Speaker, as has been highlighted on a number of occasions in the past, the nature and scope of the external threats to our financial and economic stability have changed significantly over the years. In particular, there has been a considerable expansion in the international and regional standards that we have to comply with in the areas of tax governance and cooperation, supervision and regulation, and combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism and proliferation. Mr. Speaker, as a jurisdiction committed to cooperation, transparency, and high levels of compliance, we are working tirelessly to address the challenges in these areas. Currently, we are involved in no more than 10, yes, Mr. Speaker, 10 different types of assessments or follow-up reports. We are working with the OECD Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes, on reviews of tax information exchange agreements, cybersecurity, and common reporting standards. The OECD Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, on assessment of our economic substance regime, and the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force in relation to our anti-money laundering regime. Mr. Speaker, the European Union Council and Commission also undertake assessments in any or all of these areas. They can then decide to take action if there is a need for further strengthening in any area, as evidenced by their recent decision to require and publicly record a high-level commitment from Bermuda in relation to actions to enhance our economic substance regime. Mr. Speaker, we also anticipate that in the upcoming year, we will be subject to a review of our country-by-country reporting regime, which is another tax-related assessment. Failure to reach full compliance in any of these areas can expose us to reputational challenges and could even have financial and economic consequences. Mr. Speaker, we will also continue to be involved in discussions with all of the above-named bodies, as well as the OECD Inclusive Framework responsible for the Base Erosion and Profit Sharing Initiative, the Financial Action Task Force, and key trading partners, including the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union, in relation to changes in development, updating, and implementation of international and regional standards with which we are or will be required to comply. Along with all of this, Mr. Speaker, we continue to take the necessary steps to update and strengthen our regime to ensure effective implementation. Mr. Speaker, the requirements related to the recent agreement by the G20 to approve what is commonly referred to as the OECD Global Minimum Tax Agreement will be an area of even greater focus and risk for us in this upcoming year. Determining the right construct will not be easy, but achieving success in this regard will be critical for our ongoing economic stability and security. Through appropriate collaboration with our industry partners and ongoing discussions with the various external bodies, and through taking prudent and considered action, we must and we will ensure that Bermuda's value proposition as a domicile for international business remains strong. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda's tourism industry has been battered by the pandemic. Our industry suffered from underinvestment and the collapse in travel, exposed its fragile state. The outlook right now is bleak, and there are many who may predict that our tourism industry will never recover. I am not one of them. Mr. Speaker, hospitality development presents a difficult paradigm for Bermuda on account of the high cost of labor and doing business. The concession framework within which we operate is simply not competitive. We will not have new redeveloped hotels or, sorry, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will not have new or redeveloped hotels or attract superior events with the current structure. Our competitors understand this, and we see elsewhere branded hotel development, which positions them favorably for thriving arrival numbers in the very markets that match Bermuda's price points. Mr. Speaker, there are some who will blame last year's tourism numbers on Bermuda's strict border controls. Comparing our country to other jurisdictions that had simpler border regimes and who have seen tourism numbers return to pre-pandemic levels. However, that comparison only tells part of the story. Our fellow overseas territory, Turks and Caicos, saw excellent numbers last year. But, Mr. Speaker, it is important to understand why. In 2016, the then newly elected Premier and Minister of Finance of Turks and Caicos committed to expanding concessions for hotel development on the island. The result of that decision is that over the last 5 years, a significant number of new hotel properties have been constructed, with new hotels opening last year. Most of our competitor jurisdictions offer tax concessions far in excess of what is offered in Bermuda. That is counterintuitive, as Bermuda has a high cost of business operations and additional support is needed for success. This, Mr. Speaker, is the crux of our tourism issue. It is difficult to make money in the hotel business in Bermuda, and we must change that. Those who have dollars to invest take their money to jurisdictions where it is welcome and where they can make a better return. Bermuda, on the other hand, presents challenges to investors with high energy costs, increased costs of doing business, a cooler winter, and the historic collective bargaining agreement with the Bermuda Industrial Union, which reduces efficiencies and increases operational costs. Mr. Speaker, crises often bring change. The pandemic forced the closure of our largest hotel, the Fairmont Southampton, with a loss of about 700 unionized jobs. As a part of the planning for the hotel's reopening, the Bermuda Industrial Union has negotiated a new collective bargaining agreement with the owners of the hotel, which will apply efficiencies as a precondition for approval of overseas lenders to invest in Bermuda. It is the government's hope that this new collective bargaining agreement can be the baseline for future tourism growth in Bermuda. And today, Mr. Speaker, I would like to publicly thank the Bermuda Industrial Union for coming to the table, as it will take a true tripartite effort to make tourism successful again in Bermuda. However, operational efficiencies are not enough when Bermuda must compete against other jurisdictions that are offering additional incentives for the building of new hotels. Mr. Speaker, you would have heard me speak previously in this House regarding a special act for the Fairmont Southampton. This recognizes that for a hotel to be developed in Bermuda and to attract significant capital, we must be prepared to compete with other jurisdictions. When this government came to office in 2017, we passed the Tourism Investment Act, which upgraded the old Hotel Concessions Act 2000 to extend concessions for hotel developments. Mr. Speaker, we doubled the length of concessions from 5 years to 10 years, but it is evident that there is still more work to be done. Mr. Speaker, you'll remember me mentioning Turks and Caicos and the fact that they have seen an increase in the number of hotel beds in their country. That is because in 2016, the new Premier and Minister of Finance expanded their hotel concessions to 25 years. And, Mr. Speaker, those are not even the most generous hotel concessions, as there are more jurisdictions in the Caribbean that offer 30 years or more of tax concessions in order to attract branded 5-star hotel developments to their shores. Mr. Speaker, hotel concessions of that length may seem extreme, but governments have recognized that the revenue from direct taxation of hotels pales in comparison to the money and employment generated for the country through having hotels open and operating. Hotel employment is vital, and although tourism only contributes 5% to our gross domestic product, it contributed approximately 14% to the jobs in Bermuda in 2019. Mr. Speaker, this government will this year introduce amendments to the Tourism Investment Act to increase the duration of concessions available to hotel developers in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, doing what is required to attract hotel investment does not mean that we will be reckless. We have seen what a desire to develop hotels at any cost can mean to the taxpayers of this country. The former government's failed bid to support the Caroline Bay project has had dire consequences for our public purse. In that deal, the former government guaranteed virtually all of the debt for the project, and construction was started before sufficient funding was in place to support its completion, with the project reliant on real estate sales to fund the balance of development. Mr. Speaker, that was an unacceptable risk for a massive undertaking involving persons that had no comparable experience in hotel development. What is most egregious is that in 2017, while the former government was filming election advertisements at Morgan's Point, the developers had already breached the commitments that were made for the guarantee, as they had agreed to sales targets that had not been met. Mr. Speaker, it is now clear that the former government should have never entered into the agreement as it was structured. That has been made evident as the guarantee was called, and taxpayers have now paid over $210 million for the previous administration's poor judgment. Yes, Mr. Speaker, $210 million. By contrast, this PLP government has taken a different approach. We have ensured that guarantees extended to hotels, like the one provided to the new St. Regis property in 2018, or the 2019 agreement between the former Minister of Finance and the developers of the Fairmont Southampton, do not overexpose the government. We are making sure that all hotel development is fully funded so that taxpayers are not left bearing the costs. Properties like the Fairmont Southampton, which was the largest private employer in Bermuda, are a national priority. So much in this country depends on a successful tourism industry. Without it, we do not have sufficient visitor numbers. Our attractiveness as an international business jurisdiction is reduced. And all the businesses that support it suffer, including food services, transportation, and entertainment. Tourism is essential, and it is the responsibility of the government to use all of the tools at its disposal, including appropriate guarantees where necessary to facilitate successful hotel development. Mr. Speaker, we have a demographic challenge in Bermuda, and that challenge will not magically resolve itself. It requires strong leadership to implement policies that address the issues while ensuring Bermudians benefit from economic progress. Mr. Speaker, it is expected that last year will mark the 4th consecutive year that deaths exceeded births in Bermuda. The latest projections based on recent statistics state that 25% of our population is expected to be senior citizens by 2026. Additionally, residents have left Bermuda due to the economic challenges that we currently face, especially in our tourism industry with the closure of our largest hotel. Mr. Speaker, if we do not reverse these trends, it will lead to economic disaster for Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, population growth is not simply an option for Bermuda. It is a necessity for our survival. It is not possible for Bermuda's economy to grow while our population declines and ages. A declining population in a small island state increases the cost of living. An aging population increases the cost of healthcare. A shrinking workforce puts future pensions at risk. These trends must be reversed. Our population and workforce must grow, and for that to happen, we must create jobs through domestic or foreign investment. Mr. Speaker, this growth of jobs does not mean that all persons need to be imported for the roles to be filled. If we do our job to make Bermuda a fairer place to live and work, there are Bermudians who will return. However, it is vital that we shift from the false choice of is population growth good or bad to a mindset in this country that growth is essential. How do we ensure that it benefits Bermudians who live in Bermuda? Mr. Speaker, immigration policy may be controversial, but economic and demographic realities should not be. In a modern and globalized economy, where people do not need to live in Bermuda to work for Bermudian companies, and with an aging populace and infrastructure, we will not fix the burning issues of high taxes, high cost of living, and weak business demand without increasing the number of people that live and work in Bermuda. The other side to the economic argument for population growth is the desperate need for small businesses to survive and thrive. We see that small businesses in Bermuda are hurting, and traditional local retail has been severely impacted by the pandemic. They welcome temporary assistance from the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, but what every business owner wants, whether large or small, is more customers to whom they can sell their goods or services. Mr. Speaker, if our economic pie does not expand, and our local entrepreneurs are fighting over the same 60,000 customers, there will be little collective growth. More jobs and a growing population leads to more opportunity for entrepreneurship, more opportunity for growth, and more opportunity for wealth creation. As an example, Mr. Speaker, economic investment certificates modified an existing benefited Bermudians. It changed the existing policy to require those who wish to reside in Bermuda to make investments that benefit residents, either through supporting education, sporting clubs, charities, debt reduction, new businesses, real estate, or other vital investments. Mr. Speaker, this government knows and understands what is required to build the economy, but we also know that economic growth cannot leave Bermudians as spectators to success. Jobs can be created through local investment as well. In 2019, I pledge that this government would allow Bermudians to access their pension funds that are invested overseas to invest in local Bermuda companies. I made that pledge because I have faith that Bermudians can look at what they have, assess the risks, and decide if they wish to do so to make a bet on their future. If they are confident in their plans, they should be allowed to pledge a small portion of their pension savings to invest in starting a business or to invest in a business startup to further the government's goal of creating a nation of owners. Just as we have opened up avenues for additional foreign investment, we must make it easier for Bermudians to pool their resources and invest in their own island. These changes will be implemented this year to increase domestic investment that will create jobs and in turn stabilize and eventually increase Bermuda's domestic population. Mr. Speaker, changing these demographic trends will not happen overnight. It will take time. And while there will be an economic boost this year with increased business from tourism, this government recognizes the challenges being faced by residents who need additional support and relief from Bermuda's high costs of living now. Mr. Speaker, this progressive Labor Party government has a history of reducing the burden of taxation on those who can least afford to pay. We did that in 2018 and in 2020, and we are doing it again today. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, there is a difference of philosophy, and that can be seen not just in words, but in action. It must be remembered that while the former government had the highest payroll tax rate in the history of this country for workers, Mr. Speaker, since returning to office, the Progressive Labor Party has reduced the burden of payroll taxes for all persons earning under $96,000 twice. And we are doing it again today. Mr. Speaker, I mention this because there are many persons in our community who in some way, shape, or form have become disillusioned by politics and government. They believe that there is no difference between political parties and their philosophies. But, Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. The contrast could not be starker, and this government will continue to be true to its core principles, that we must build a better and fairer Bermuda. One of the most important aspects of this is that individuals who have more should pay more, and those who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum must have relief, especially given the high cost of living in Bermuda. While the government has not made any major tax system changes for this budget year, relief must be provided to Bermudians who will be challenged over the next year with the increasing cost of living. Mr. Speaker, I want to assure all persons listening and those who will read this budget statement over the next few days that the government is committed to reducing the tax burden and providing additional relief during this fiscal year for residents and businesses beyond the relief that will be announced today. Over the last few years, our discipline in spending and strong revenue receipts have made our budget deficits lower than anticipated. During this upcoming fiscal year, the government will commit to a mid-year review that will take place in September. If our conservative revenue estimates are exceeded and spending remains in line with estimates, we will provide additional tax relief to residents. First, Mr. Speaker, we will return 50% of any additional surplus to the taxpayers of this country. This means that if the projected deficit for 2021-22 comes in below the estimates, 50% of those funds will be used to reduce taxes on fuel imports to reduce the cost of electricity in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, the government understands that the cost of living is a major challenge. Though we cannot control many of the factors that contribute to the cost of living, as we import most of our goods, we can control the amount of taxes that are charged for those items as they enter the country. And Mr. Speaker, history again is very important, as it is important to note that the former government raised taxes on fuel by 110% during the time that they were in office. 110%, Mr. Speaker. It is the goal of this government to reduce the taxes on fuel imports to reduce the cost of electricity. Mr. Speaker, the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia is likely to put further pressure on electricity prices due to the increase in the price of oil. Reductions in duty for fuel imports will reduce electricity bills and provide a cushion for Bermudian households and against further costs and inflation pressures from increasing energy prices. Mr. Speaker, it has long been a known irritation in Bermuda that the birthday gift from the government of Bermuda for those persons owning a private car is a very large bill for your annual licensing fee. This year, to provide further relief across the board to all residents, the government is cutting the vehicle licensing fees for private cars by 10%. Let me repeat that again, Mr. Speaker. The government is cutting the vehicle licensing fees for all private cars by 10%. Mr. Speaker, there is a reason why vehicle fees are as high as they are, and that is because as far back as the 1990s, it was the practice of governments to increase fees for all services and licenses by 5% every year. That was known as the biennial fee review. The last such review was in 2018. Since that time, this government has halted that practice, and we have not implemented across the board increases in fees, as we are committed to reducing the pressures on Bermuda's families and Bermuda's businesses. Mr. Speaker, in this government's 2020 election platform, we committed to eliminating payroll taxes for earnings under $48,000. Mr. Speaker, we are not able to meet that entire commitment this year, but we will get started. Since our election, we have steadily reduced the payroll tax burden on those persons making less than $96,000. And there are further reductions in store for those persons in this budget. In 2017, before this government was elected, a worker earning $48,000 a year would pay $2,280 of those dollars, or 4.75% in payroll taxes. Next year, that worker will pay only $720, or 1.5%, a reduction of $1,560, or 68% since this government took office, and a reduction of $240 compared to last year. Mr. Speaker, that same worker will have paid almost $5,000 less in taxes during the time that this government has been in office. And for a family, Mr. Speaker, that amounts to $9,840 in savings over 5 years. Mr. Speaker, today's reduction brings more relief for workers to assist with the burden of the increased cost of living. Finally, Mr. Speaker, there are no tax increases in this budget, and anyone making more than $96,000 will not see their payroll taxes increase. Mr. Speaker, I will now touch on further relief measures in this budget. Mr. Speaker, the initial supplementary unemployment benefit program was created and implemented via the Public Treasury Administration and Payments Supplemental Benefits Regulations 2020 and provides assistance to unemployed persons who do not qualify for financial assistance. This legislation had a commencement date of the 17th of September 2020, and the initial expiry date of the program was the 31st of March 2021. However, there have been 2 extensions to this program, and the current expiration date is the 31st of March this year. From its inception in September 2020 to now, 172 individuals have received this assistance provided by this government to people unable to find work in the wake of the pandemic for a total cost of $1,743,460. Mr. Speaker, thankfully, the trend analysis points to a continued month-on-month decrease in the number of supplemental unemployment benefit applications submitted by the public. However, we will not remove this safety net at this time, and I'm pleased to advise this Honorable House and the public that the Cabinet's approval will be sought to extend the supplemental unemployment benefit program until the 31st of April 2022. Mr. Speaker, since the onset of the pandemic, hotels, restaurants, bars, and nightclubs have enjoyed relief from payroll taxes. These payroll tax concessions will be extended for at least another 6 months to support these businesses and their employees as they look to recover during this summer season. Mr. Speaker, in 2018, the Progressive Labor Party introduced incentives for businesses to employ more persons in Bermuda. This relief was targeted at the international businesses and large local employers to create jobs in Bermuda. This new hire relief was further extended in 2020, but it is set to expire on March 31st, 2022. This relief will be extended for a further 2 years to support hiring in the local economy and is applicable to local companies and international companies with an annual remuneration of $500,000 or more. Mr. Speaker, some charities are having difficulty claiming relief from land taxes due to the fact that they raise significant funds from international business. The government wants to encourage continued giving from our international business community to our local charities. As such, we will make amendments to the Land Valuation and Tax Act to make it explicit that registered charities who earn a majority of their funds from donations are exempt from land taxes. Mr. Speaker, care homes look after those in our society who most need our assistance. But the pressures of the pandemic have stressed the finances of many of Bermuda's care homes. Therefore, the government will make amendments to the Land Valuation and Tax Act to remove land taxes from registered care homes. Mr. Speaker, over the last 2 years, the government has allowed persons to have voluntary access to their pensions in case they are having difficulty making ends meet due to reduced hours or reduced business. In 2020, residents could withdraw up to $12,000, and in 2021, they could withdraw up to $6,000. This voluntary withdrawal for up to $6,000 will be extended a final time to provide an additional avenue for relief for those Bermudians who really need it. Mr. Speaker, in line with the recommendations from the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, the government will impanel a new tax reform commission before the end of April. This commission will have the long-term work of appropriately adjusting Bermuda's local system of taxation in line with requirements arising from the new OECD global tax agreements. Additionally, this commission will be assigned the task of near-term changes to our system of taxation to ensure that the recommendations from the Fiscal Responsibility Panel for a more progressive system of taxation in Bermuda are implemented swiftly. We must also acknowledge that an essential benefit of changing our system of taxation is to deal with the most pressing issues in Bermuda: the cost of living and the cost of doing business. The main taxes that Bermuda uses to collect revenue, customs duties, payroll taxes, and taxes on fuel, increase the cost of living and the cost of doing business. A fairer tax system can help us reduce our cost of living, which in turn will boost economic growth. And that is why it is essential that it be advanced. Mr. Speaker, while I will not prejudge the result of the Tax Reform Commission's work, the Ministry of Finance must advance policies that make our financial system fair. Therefore, this government will introduce the following policies to make our financial system work better for consumers. Mr. Speaker, banks are a vital part of the financial system and play an important role in our domestic economy. The government is on record regarding its desire to diversify the banking system and is excited that the Bermuda Monetary Authority is set to issue its first license for a new bank in 21 years. However, banks and financial institutions can also place citizens at a disadvantage, and it is the responsibility of the government to ensure a level playing field. As such, this government will bring legislation to give courts the power to postpone the execution of an order of possession in appropriate circumstances where payment plans can be established. The legislation will also give the courts the ability to adjudge and grant appropriate relief to customers who can show that their loan agreements were unfair. Additionally, amendments to the Banks and Deposits Company Act outlined in the 2021 throne speech will be advanced this session to create conduct rules for the local banking sector, including creating limits on the fees charged for customers to access banking services. Mr. Speaker, one of the priority items in the government's 2020 election manifesto was the creation of a Bermuda digital bank. The report from the Fiscal Responsibility Panel discusses the benefits and possible risks of such an institution. The government commissioned a business plan for the Bermuda Digital Bank, and that plan lays out a number of preconditions that are required for digital banking to be successful in Bermuda. One of these issues is open banking, to ensure that bank operations are interoperable and information is able to be readily exchanged. This is the underlying infrastructure that allows for technological solutions to be deployed in banking. This year, the government will advance, through the Bermuda Monetary Authority, open banking standards that will lay the foundation for the creation of digital banking in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, I will now turn my attention to the financial performance for the current fiscal year and next fiscal year. I will also lay out a path to a balanced budget and how the government will meet the target set by the Fiscal Responsibility Panel of achieving a $50 million surplus by the fiscal year 2026-2027. Mr. Speaker, before I get to this year's numbers, I must make a brief mention of the performance for the last fiscal year, 2020-2021. During last year's budget presentation, the revised deficit for the fiscal year 2020-2021 was projected to be $245 million. However, the actual deficit, according to the final numbers, which are reported in the financial statements table today, shows that the deficit was $61 million less than that figure, coming in at $184 million. Mr. Speaker, before proceeding further on the estimates for the 2022-23 budget, I would like to provide an update on the government's financial performance. the continued impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the forecast for the current fiscal year 2021-2022. Mr. Speaker, the latest revised forecast projects that the government will earn $1.03 billion in revenue in 2021-22. This is $31.3 million or 3.1% more than the $998.9 million in the original budget estimates. This is primarily due to customs duty, passenger tax, civil aviation receipts, and travel authorization fees performing better than expected. Although those increases were somewhat offset by lower collections in land tax, international company fees, and passenger taxes. Mr. Speaker, the projected 2021-22 operating expenses of the government, excluding debt service and guarantee management, are $904.3 million, or $16.3 million, or 1.8%, more than the $888 million originally budgeted. Significant contributors to the increase in anticipated current account expenditure included the additional $11.1 million the Bermuda Hospitals Board to meet the funding shortfall. To offset additional operating expenses, the government realized savings in salaries, wages, and employee overheads, materials, and supplies. Mr. Speaker, it is also worth noting that the effects of the coronavirus pandemic lasted longer than anticipated a year ago. With multiple variants of the virus reaching and spreading throughout the island. Therefore, the cost of COVID-19 related expenses for this fiscal year is expected to be $35.1 million, $20.1 million, or 134% more than the $15 million that was originally budgeted. Including within these expenses are unemployment benefits, coronavirus testing and lab operations, the vaccination program, quarantine facilities, and, Mr. Speaker, the $16 million airport minimum revenue guarantee. $16 million, Mr. Speaker. The increase in revenue was not enough to offset the increased COVID-19 related expenses and operating expenses. Therefore, the government also reduced its capital expenditure budget from the $92.9 million originally budgeted to $75.5 million. Mr. Speaker, given the high levels of public debt, the continued costs incurred by the Caroline Bay project, debt service and guarantee management costs are estimated to be $132.8 million for this fiscal year, $5.1 million or 4% above the original estimate of $127.8 million. This increase above budget is a result of $5 million spent on costs related to the Morgan's Point Caroline Bay project. Mr. Speaker, given the figures outlined above, I am pleased to report that the revised estimate of the overall deficit for fiscal year 2021-22 is $117.4 million, or 7.36% less than the $124.7 million deficit that was originally projected. This result demonstrates our commitment to prudent management of taxpayer funds. As of the 31st of March 2022, net debt is projected to stand at $3.1 billion, with the sinking fund balance to be approximately $231 million, which is sufficient to fund future deficits. Mr. Speaker, I will now turn my attention to the budget estimates for the upcoming fiscal year 2022-2023. The highlights of the 2022-23 budget forecast a $78.9 million increase in revenue, which equates to 7.9%, and a $50.1 million increase in current account expenditure, or 6.4%, when compared to last year's original estimate. As a result, the current account balance before debt service and guarantee management costs is budgeted to be a surplus of $132.7 million. The current account balance after debt service is projected to be a $3 million surplus, representing a $34.9 million improvement when compared to 2021-2022. The overall deficit, inclusive of capital expenditure, is projected at $70 million, a $54.7 million or 43.9% reduction from the 2021-22 original estimate of $124.7 million. Mr. Speaker, the projected current account balance, excluding debt service costs, indicates whether revenues can support the day-to-day running of the government. This year's budget, with a current account surplus of $132.7 million, indicates that according to projections, the government will generate sufficient revenue to cover not only the day-to-day running of government, but also interest costs, a major financial milestone as we restore public finances. Mr. Speaker, the estimates for 2022-23 project government revenues of $1.08 billion, which is $78.9 million higher than the original estimate for the previous year. This increase in the estimate is primarily a result of projected strength in tourism-related revenues, customs duty, and stamp duty. Mr. Speaker, the government has set the overall 2022-23 budget for current account expenditure at $945.1 million, $57.1 million higher than the original 2020-2022 estimate. Key factors for the increase are the discontinuation of austerity measures involving the pay of civil servants. Additionally, there is no separate line item for COVID-19, so all pandemic-related expenses, such as the operation of the molecular diagnostic laboratory, are now captured within various ministry budgets. The level of expenditure delivers on the commitments laid out in the 2021 throne speech regarding funding for healthcare reform, implementing Bermuda's first 2 signature schools, and establishing a regulated cannabis regime. Mr. Speaker, debt service costs for 2022-2023 budget are projected at $129.8 million, 1.6% higher than the 2021-2022 initial allocation of $127.8 million. Although interest payments are estimated at the same level of $127.8 million, $2 million of guarantee management costs projected related to the Morgan's Point, Caroline Bay project, and the Fairmount Southampton project. Mr. Speaker, the capital expenditure component of the 2022-23 budget is set at $73 million, $19.9 million lower than the 2021-22 original estimate. Of this $73 million, $51 million is for capital development and $21 million is for capital acquisitions. The most significant items of capital development expenditure in the 2022-23 budget relate to the $7 million towards Tynes Bay waste treatment upgrades and $3 million to be spent on the maintenance of our public schools to ensure that their buildings are safe for students to attend. Mr. Speaker, when looking at the $21 million for capital acquisitions, $9 million, or 42% of that figure, is to be invested in information technology upgrades throughout the government of Bermuda and in our schools. These investments will make the government more efficient while upgrading technology in our public schools. $5 million has been budgeted to purchase additional new buses and to refit one of our fast ferries. Additionally, the government has allocated $1 million to commence the installation of the new island-wide CCTV system that was promised in this year's throne speech. Mr. Speaker, Before I move on, I would like to advise honorable members and the audience watching or listening at home that I will not be providing individual highlights for the 12 ministries of the government in this speech. We have 56 hours of debate on these estimates over the next 3 weeks in this honorable House, and the ministers of the government will take the time to share the plans and policies that they will put into place. There is no need for me to steal their thunder today, Mr. Speaker. Moving on to a path to a balanced budget. Mr. Speaker, I know that there will be some in the community, and I'm sure in the opposition, who will look to the increased spending and deficit this year and the one-year delay to the return to a balanced budget as a reason to criticize this government's fiscal management. However, I promise at the beginning of this statement that I'll be realistic with where we are financially. Therefore, I would like to quote from the 2021 report of the Fiscal Responsibility Panel. And I quote, Mr. Speaker, however, after cutting expenditure by 5.1% in the teeth of the pandemic in 2020-2021, the 2021 budget increased current account spending, excluding debt service and the now discontinued contributions to the sinking fund by about 1% a year, and barely enough to cover inflation in each of the next 3 years to 2023-2024. Such continued austerity may be challenging to achieve, particularly against the backdrop of the ambitious policies set out in the Economic Recovery Plan and the need to renew and modernize Bermuda's public infrastructure, end quote. Mr. Speaker, in the last budget presentation, the government was projected to balance the budget by the next fiscal year, 2023-2024. Mr. Speaker, this is not possible due to the need to continue to implement the government's economic recovery plan, reform Bermuda's healthcare and education systems, and fund necessary capital investments to replace and repair aging infrastructure while continuing to support programs for the vulnerable. And, Mr. Speaker, I might add, without increasing taxes on our residents. Given that full economic recovery will not be able to occur until the Fairmont Southampton is reopened, the new target for achieving a balanced budget has now been delayed by 1 year to the fiscal year 2024-2025. Last year, the deficit target for this fiscal year, 2022-2023, was set at $41 million. Mr. Speaker, the Fiscal Responsibility Panel was clear when it stated that continued austerity would be difficult to achieve in the near term, given the government's ambitious economic recovery plan. That $41 million target estimated that current account spending would increase by just 1% from $888 million to $896 million, inclusive of any COVID-related spending. Mr. Speaker, $896 million in current account expenditure for this fiscal year would have been impossible to meet without sending a significant number of public officers home or cutting services even more than the reductions that will be necessary in this budget. When examining what $896 million represented, it became clear that there would have to have been redundancies in the police, fire, prison services, and throughout many critical government departments. In addition, it would have required severe cuts to social services that protect the vulnerable in our community and provide support for our seniors. And, Mr. Speaker, the $896 million projection did not take into account the fact that the $888 million estimated for this current financial year contained a number of one-time measures that expired during the year, such as the salary reductions for all public officers that were in effect for 3 months this current fiscal year, and the Bermuda Police Service for half the fiscal year. That projection also did not anticipate further payments to Skyport for the minimum revenue guarantee. Mr. Speaker, the $945 million of current account expenditure for the next fiscal year, 2022-23, will still require a significant number of reductions in services in order to meet that target. Cabinet ministers will detail these measures during the Committee of Supply. The reductions can be seen across the board, where grants have been reduced in certain areas, services will have to be limited, and hiring will be frozen. This $945 million is an accurate baseline for future current account spending, but it will still require significant spending discipline in order to ensure that this target can be met. Mr. Speaker, revenues are projected to increase by 4% next year, which represents a further recovery of Bermuda's tourism sector, although that will be offset by the ending of the travel authorization fee, which is projected to cost the government at least $22 million. In theory, Mr. Speaker, we could have had a balanced budget next year with additional tourism growth, but that would require keeping the travel authorization and accompanying fee in place for a further year, which goes against the government's commitment to ending both on the 31st of March, 2023. However, Mr. Speaker, what is important to note is that the level of debt when we balance the budget in 2024-25 will be less than was projected during last year's budget presentation. This is due to the fact that our deficits over the last 2 fiscal years are $68 million less than projected. That strong financial performance means that Bermuda is on track to beat the debt target set out last year, meaning our debt profile is improving, and that, Mr. Speaker, should be celebrated. Mr. Speaker, I would like to quote from the Fiscal Responsibility Panel's annual assessment, which stated the government's commitment to the budget, which stated, sorry, let me scroll back. And I quote, Mr. Speaker, the government's commitment to budget balance by fiscal year 2023-24 and the minister's commitment to sticking to the 2021-22 spending allocations are very welcome. However, we are concerned that there is no clear guide to policy thereafter. We therefore recommend that the next budget, the government commits to a further set of specific time-bound objectives for revenue and budget balance after 2022-23, consistent with our previous reports. We recommend the government target a surplus of $50 million per annum to be achieved by fiscal year 2026-27 and continue thereafter to pay down the debt and demonstrate real progress towards meeting the debt to revenue targets. Mr. Speaker, the Fiscal Responsibility Panel called for near-term metrics be put into place in order for the government to generate a $50 million surplus in the fiscal year 2026-27, 4 budgets from now. The government has responded to that recommendation by setting out a path that will get us to a $50 million surplus in the time that has been recommended. Mr. Speaker, this means that expenses will have to be controlled while we continue to grow revenue. Most of that revenue growth will come from economic growth. However, the Tax Reform Commission will be impaneled, and we're expecting that its near-term recommendations will see revenue uplifts next year of 4% and the following fiscal year of 5%. After those 2 years, revenue is expected to increase by 3% per year. On the expense side, we have projected an increase of 0.5% for the next fiscal year, followed by a 1.5% increase in the 3 subsequent fiscal years. This glide path will meet the target of having a $50 million surplus in fiscal year 2026-2027. Mr. Speaker, our public officers have gone 2 years without pay increases and continue to provide services under incredibly difficult circumstances. In that context, I am pleased to state that the increases that have been projected in the fiscal years 2024-25 and 2025-26 will be able to provide an uplift in salaries for public officers. We are all in this together, and part of the government's mandate in its negotiations with public officers is to enlist them to ensure that savings are met. It will be difficult, however, to ask public officers to wait a further 2 years for any salary increases. Therefore, salary increases for the near term will have to be funded by efficiency savings that exceed the budget targets that have been set. And we will request our public officers and union partners to work with us to identify and implement those savings. Mr. Speaker, I'll now touch on the issue of managing the debts. Again, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin my remarks with a quotation from the 2021 Fiscal Responsibility Panel Annual Assessment, which said, and I quote, "Given the scale of Bermuda's debt, the possibility of a large sustained rise in interest rates remains one of the serious risks facing Bermuda. The government should be alive to opportunities to refinance existing debt due within the next few years, while bond yields are still close to historic lows and spreads on Bermudian debt relative to treasuries remain low." Mr. Speaker, this budget statement has highlighted the serious challenges that Bermuda is facing in many areas. In relation to the management of debt, the key upcoming challenge is the need to refinance almost $1 billion in debt over the next 2 years, with approximately $500 million of it maturing in the upcoming fiscal year. As noted previously, there have already been positive developments with actual and expected deficits coming in at lower levels than originally estimated. Thus, it is expected that with careful, continued fiscal management, as detailed in this statement, the sinking fund will be sufficient to finance the anticipated deficits until we achieve a budget balance. However, Mr. Speaker, the current market environment for the required refinancing clearly presents risks in relation to the effective management of future debt servicing costs. Interest rates in the United States and other key countries have begun to trend higher, with further upward movement expected. Therefore, to address those risks, this government will take steps to access the markets, the debt markets earlier, to ensure that we can refinance our debt at historically low interest rates in line with the recommendation from the fiscal. Mr. Speaker, regarding pension reform, the 2021 Fiscal Responsibility Panel Annual Assessment stated, and I quote, "Pension reform in Bermuda will, as elsewhere, require a combination of measures, including increased contributions, whether through raising contribution rates, the number of contributors, or some combination of the two, adjusted benefits, and higher retirement ages reflecting increased longevity and working lives. All this is simply arithmetic. The alternative is that funds will simply run out of money to pay future pensions." End quote. Mr. Speaker, this government recognized the importance and need for reform of our social insurance and public sector pension plans to ensure that pensions are there in the future for those who need them. Therefore, we commissioned McKinsey & Company, a global management consulting firm, to define a pathway for Bermuda's pension system that will allow us to achieve sustainability. Mr. Speaker, progressing such an initiative is critical to address the funding gaps that have continued to increase at ever-growing rates over recent years in both the public sector superannuation fund and the contributory pension fund. The recently published Contributory Pension Fund Actuarial Report highlighted the importance of the CPF in providing basic pension benefits to approximately 14,000 persons, of whom nearly 11,000 are senior citizens. The government also recognizes that for some people in our community, social insurance benefits are a much-needed component of their retirement income. And for many public sector employees, the pension derived by the public sector superannuation fund is their primary source of income when they retire. Mr. Speaker, similar to many countries around the globe, Bermuda is having to deal with challenges related to an aging population. This reality, along with a shrinking workforce, has resulted in benefit payments growing at a much faster rate than contributions to these funds. Mr. Speaker, although the investment performance of these funds has exceeded the relevant benchmarks, that has not been sufficient to stem the growth in funding deficit of the Contributory Pension Fund and the Public Sector Superannuation Fund. The Contributory Pension Fund Actuarial Report also estimated that the CPF is projected to decline steadily until it is exhausted in 2044 under the best time estimate scenario, which is 3 years earlier than estimated in the previous review. A similar assessment of the Public Sector Superannuation Fund determined that without appropriate intervention, the fund would be depleted in 2041. Mr. Speaker, in this budget statement, we have already highlighted the concrete steps that this government has taken to demonstrate our commitment to focus on taking care of our seniors. Commissioning McKinsey & Company to undertake this critical work is yet another positive and necessary initiative in this regard. Mr. Speaker, under the leadership and guidance of the Ministry of Finance, as well as the Public Funds Investment Committee chaired by Mr. Barclay Simmons, McKinsey & Company has undertaken considerable work to develop a plan to strengthen the Bermuda pension system. To date, it has assessed the scope of issues to be addressed and determined an appropriate strategy for achieving the desired objective. There has been considerable dialogue with key stakeholders, including ministers, union leaders, public sector employees, as well as international and local business leaders to understand their perspectives and appetite for change. Though through this reform process and the relevant analysis, McKinsey & Company has formulated a discrete set of reform combinations using 3 main levers, which are changes in benefits, contributions, and the retirement age. Mr. Speaker, in the upcoming year, it is anticipated that using the feedback received and additional further assessment, McKinsey will be able to further refine its reform combinations and through further consultation, communication, and education, will be able to finalize proposals for stabilizing and strengthening the CPF and PSSF. Successful completion of this initiative will resolve a long-standing issue and be extremely positive for Bermuda, both from a domestic perspective for our seniors as well as an international one. Mr. Speaker, I will now conclude my remarks. Mr. Speaker, the opportunity to connect with individual voters is amongst the most fulfilling aspects of politics and public service. I canvass my constituency because it grounds me. It keeps me connected to those things that concern the people we were all elected to serve. Our constituents are candid and honest, and through my regular interactions with them, I hear a constant refrain. We know how hard you're working, but keep going. Keep working hard because we are counting on it. Mr. Speaker, I venture to say that that is not unique to Constituency 18, and that up and down this country, honorable members may hear similar sentiments. When I am tired and wonder if we'll ever see our way out of the pandemic, or when I become frustrated because the pace of change is not as fast as I would like it to be, just a few hours in my constituency renews my energy. I draw on the hopes that others have for us as a government and on the trust that has been placed in us by such an overwhelming majority. It is inspiring. The wisdom of our constituents, Mr. Speaker, is mirrored in the report of the Fiscal Responsibility Panel, which concluded by saying the following, and I quote, "Bermuda has now largely emerged from the worst of the pandemic. In our view, with the right policies, the prospects of the island are bright. The potential of the island and its people should not be in doubt. While many long-standing challenges remain, policies to address them are being developed, and we were impressed by the sense of urgency on the part of the government and the shared commitment of other stakeholders," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the challenges of the moment are real, but this government has provided a solid platform for economic growth through the implementation of Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan. The continued strength in the international business sector demonstrates that Bermuda remains an attractive domicile for this vital economic pillar. We are continuing to invest required resources in a prudent and considered way to protect and expand our revenue base. We are diversifying the economy through growth in fintech and related digital asset businesses. We are on the cusp of a redeveloped Fairmount Southampton hotel, which will create jobs and play a significant part in the renewal of tourism. There is hope for the future, Mr. Speaker, not a vain hope, but one that is tangible and visible, and one in which the people can have faith and trust. Today, Mr. Speaker, this Bermuda Progressive Labor Party government has delivered a budget that funds the critical programs that we committed to in our election platform and the most recent throne speech, while providing relief to hardworking families and businesses. We remain on track with our debt targets and have a clear path to a budget surplus. We are making vital investments in our future while transforming our economy and education system and delivering on the pledge of universal health care. Mr. Speaker, the last 2 years have been tough, and I know that there are so many Bermudians that feel that they are losing hope. We have been tested like we have never been tested before. But just like we have done before, as a country, we will persevere. Bermuda has always innovated in order to survive. We have always adjusted our sails to ensure that we are on the right course. And a once-in-a-century pandemic will not stop us from doing what we have always done as a country, coming together to build a better future for our children. Mr. Speaker, we are building a Bermuda for the future. A Bermuda that is a leader in renewable energy. A Bermuda that is a leader in financial technology. A Bermuda that is on the forefront of financial services. A Bermuda with a renewed tourism industry that will deliver jobs and opportunities for residents. A Bermuda that welcomes foreign investment. A Bermuda that creates a nation of owners. A Bermuda that has a fair tax system, and a Bermuda where affordable healthcare is a right and not a privilege. Mr. Speaker, we listened during our time in opposition and executed our policies when we became the government. We demonstrated that we are a government that puts Bermudians first during the pandemic. We built a better and fairer Bermuda. We will, Mr. Speaker, build a better and fairer Bermuda for our children to call home. And this government is one that will continue to deliver the strong leadership that is required to transform our economy for the future. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased, therefore, on behalf of this Bermuda Progressive Labor Party government, to commend to this honorable House the estimates of revenue and expenditure for fiscal year 2022-2023. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.